Thank you, Christopher. Yeah, the Premier mentioned there's $180 billion of government infrastructure over the next 4 years, much of that in Western Sydney. And this is leveraging that to make sure those benefits are accrued to the community. The Premier also did mention that his focus going ahead is going to be on building community, and that is the focus of our next panel. And I'd like to invite our panellists up on stage. If you'd like to make your way up as I'm talking, that would be much appreciated. This is going to consider how best to leverage that investment, and on the panel is Vanessa, Pilla, who is one of the National Lead Social Advisory and Research at RPS, Australia Asia Pacific, one of the people who wrote the paper Chris was referring to. Joining Vanessa, Ashley Jarquin, the General Manager of Customer and Corporate Affairs from Holland. Danny O'Connor, who Chris name-checked as well a second ago, who's now the Chair of TAFE New South Wales. And our Provocateur, Sarah, if you'd like to come up as well, Dr Sarah Hill, the Chief Executive Officer of the Western Parkland City Authority. This session is entitled Setting a New Infrastructure Compact. How do we plan, measure and deliver a social, economic legacy from this investment? Please welcome our panel.
Well, hello everyone, and a big shout out to my sisters in the room who are wearing yellow pants today. Thank you. I think it's International Yellow Pants Day, but I think it's a sign of we need to have a bit of fun and we need to shake things up a little bit as we head towards Christmas. So we're going to try and make this a bit interactive. So can I encourage you guys to think of some good questions for our panel? We don't want to talk at you for this next session. We really want to hear your thoughts and ideas, and also let's try and shake it up a little bit and challenge our panel. We've had a bit of a pre-meet and I know they're ready for it and they're up for a good discussion. But I'm going to kick off while you're thinking of your great questions. I'm going to kick off with the co-author of the report, Humanising Infrastructure, and what a superb title. So I'm going to ask Vanessa, firstly, why this report and why now?
Thanks, Sarah. Look, really over the last 10 years, there's been a growing global movement around social value, what it means, and as Chris said, how can we leverage government spending to deliver really meaningful and enduring benefit? There's not really a consistent definition around social value globally, but there are some really common traits to note. So I think it's important, it's fundamental really, that it's about improving an individual's quality of life, which the Premier spoke about, and well-being, because of this investment, and then measuring that change that has happened. And the UK's really been leading the way, and New Zealand has even adopted a wellbeing budgeting process where they quantify using the Australian Social Value Bank, in fact, as part of their cost-benefit analysis. Okay. So what we wanted to do in this report was really analyse and understand the global policies that are happening around the world, and then put a domestic lens on it. So we did look at New South Wales, Queensland and Victoria. And I think it's important to note that while we don't have a Social Value Act in Australia, there are actually a lot of policies in place, both state level and federal level, that try to achieve these social outcomes. But they are predominantly around procurement. So we talk about local content, Indigenous participation, supporting SMEs. Even Infrastructure Australia's new guidelines have really elevated the requirements around benefits and thinking about how we get stakeholder and community endorsement for projects. And I think, again, as Chris said, there's a growing need even on the business side of things in terms of the rise in ESG reporting. So why now? It's just perfect opportunity with Western Sydney really being able to be an exemplar of how we can deliver social value to really deliver this, we use the words resilient, prosperous and livable city.
So a real time to leverage what is a phenomenal investment in infrastructure, but a real time of social change, and really to optimise on that and to turn it into something that is the good for all. Now, Danny, you were just described as the gel or the fulcrum, all in one sentence, and as the sort of centrepiece on our panel today. I'm going to ask you a little bit about, your incredible experience in health and education, and now as chair at TAFE. A little bit about what are we doing well, but frankly, what can we do better, and how do we really leverage off a government at the moment that is so incredibly supportive of making the most of these big bits of investment we've made? How can we really drive social outcomes and a social legacy on the back of this commitment?
In many ways, I think the answer to that has been very adequately provided by the report, and indeed by some of the things the Premier said. But let me just start by reflecting on one thing the Premier said and one thing the Premier didn't say. So the Premier said, we build to improve quality of life. And then he went on to say words like, high quality of life equals access to work. Well, access to work, in many respects, is driven by access to education, both prior to work and during work. Let me just comment on something the Premier didn't say. So the Premier said, quite rightly, and I understand why, we, the government, are responsible for infrastructure around schools, hospitals, roads and rail. Yep. He omitted to speak to the issue of digital technology. For obvious reasons, a significant level of responsibility for digital technology, infrastructure and capability rests across governments, and the state government can only assume some responsibility for that. But now to come around and answer your question.
Thank you.
So in many ways, one of the key themes today is how do you make sense of infrastructure as an opportunity? So the three things that I would say in response to your question is that we need to identify opportunities to leverage partnerships with hard and soft infrastructure. Now that needs to occur between and amongst educational institutions, but also between those institutions and other places such as industry. Now places like Meadowbank, Wagga Wagga are fine examples where, and indeed Bradfield City, fine examples where there is a lot of work occurring, much more yet to occur about the interface of leveraging opportunity between industries in order to achieve a great result for education and jobs in the West. But let me return to the second issue on my list, which is digital technology. Oh my goodness. What have we learned over the last 12 to 18 months about the digital technology capability in this country? I have spoken to more robots by Zoom and people who speak like Daleks than I ever have in my life. And yet I am in the comfortable position of being middle class and well-resourced.
Yep.
For those people who aren't, I wonder how they did it. And the final thing that I'd say in response to your question is we actually don't, although I think the paper alludes to it, we actually don't have a good framework for leveraging on human capital infrastructure. When you think about these various institutions that we think about, there's an enormous brains trust within them, and sure, there's some sharing of those brains trusts across those organisations, but nowhere near enough. We need to think about human capital as an infrastructure asset as well.
So Danny, I'm going to double down on that question of digital because as many of us have experience with homeschooling and working at home, it's an absolutely key component of our society now. But the terrifying facts that we've seen in southwest Sydney of school children and access to the digital, has really, I think, woken us up to this digital divide, not just the smashed avocado or the goat's cheese curtain and all those sorts of elements, but the digital divide driving so much of it. Just doubling down on that, when we look at $108 billion worth of investment in infrastructure across the state over the forwards, are we investing enough in our digital infrastructure? And if not, where should we be focusing our energy? To you, Danny.
well, frankly, let's go to the evidence. The evidence is there in the experience and the divisions in the experience of different people across our great city and indeed the state and the nation. If you look at where the NBN has been rolled out, where the greatest power exists around the digital backbone, if you like, it is demonstrably unequal across the state and the country. And Western Sydney, southwestern Sydney, are certainly on that map of not being as adequately resourced. But then go to the tools to actually enable the use of the backbone. Once again, there's a very, very significant, if you go to, for example, schools and the distribution of those resources within schools, whilst, for example, in New South Wales, School Ed does a great job in trying to have equitable allocation of those resources across the state, there's still a long way to go to ensure that that actually works.
Thanks, Danny. Now, I'm just reaching out to everyone here in real life. We don't have little hands on our monitors, but put your hand up if you've got a question, and cooking up a good one for our panel. So want to see some interaction. I'm going to move now to Ashley. So, Ashley, we've heard a lot today about the focus from this big infrastructure, although still an enormous commitment to putting our city-shaping infrastructure in place, given we are building a city in Western Sydney at the moment. So big focus around infrastructure and communities, and I turn to you as someone really with, boots on the ground, and from your perspective, really what is the social legacy we can be driving from this incredible investment and through the construction sector? And frankly, what are we learning from elsewhere that we can do better?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. Absolutely. I think echoing everything that everyone shared today, we all know that there is an enormous potential to leverage social value out of infrastructure. And gosh, it would just be the biggest missed opportunity if we do not take this time to wrap our arms around it right now. And the truth is, it's not really controversial or groundbreaking. New South Wales is absolutely lagging. If we look just at Australia, thinking about Victoria as an example, I think the report actually showed, given the commitment that they've made in this space over the last 3 years, 75% of social spend has occurred in Victoria, compared to just 20% here in New South Wales across the infrastructure spend. So absolute missed opportunity, but also I think a chance to learn from those other states. If we just take the example of Victoria again, they've actually done the work to set up frameworks, to set up, really, really strong commitment and priority through government, from, premiers, ministers, all the way down through bureaucracies, to coordinate this effort, to set really strong targets, and importantly, to then actually invest in improving and bolstering the social enterprise sector. So they've done that, they've showed us how it can be done, and there's also lessons there in terms of what's maybe not working as well that we could certainly take on board and do things better in Western Sydney and do things better in New South Wales. And Sarah, I think the other point I'd make is that, for companies like ours and for large national advisory services, construction companies, because of those other states like Victoria and Queensland leading the way, we're now set up to do this. We're set up to do this well. Social impact is now a really strong discipline within our sector. Very well respected social procurement experts throughout the construction industry who are used to working with community, used to meeting targets, and it's almost our bread and butter now, and it's such a visible gap for New South Wales not to be seizing on that.
And so back to Vanessa, and really kind of picking up on that point, if we're set up so well, and we've got 3 great recommendations in the report, why is this so hard? Why are we still here talking about this now? And we've been talking about this for decades, as far as I'm aware of. Why is it so hard if we all agree it's so critical?
Yeah, look, and I think there's 2 parts to that answer. I think the first one, which is what the report is picking up on, is that particularly New South Wales government policy around social benefit, social capital benefit, is delivered in a piecemeal way. So there isn't this overarching vision of what we're trying to achieve and how we're going to get there. But second part of that answer is it actually takes time and it's hard. You can't create social capital by implementing policy. Social capital it's our role to enable more of a bottom-up approach, and that requires stronger engagement with individuals, with businesses who are working in communities, and that's what COVID has shown us, that connection to communities. So the report talks about the role of social enterprises and the role they play in building those connections. And I just, again, for clarity for people who don't understand what a social enterprise is, they are a unique business model because as well as striving to be commercially viable, they're also driven by social outcomes or sometimes environmental outcomes. And therefore they experience additional challenges as a business because they're taking on the risk of working with people who face barriers to employment. And as Ashley pointed out, I think there is a lot for us to learn from other policies around Australia. And I think one of those things is really what it has highlighted is the lack of supply, the lack of businesses operating at the right scale to really benefit from the opportunities we're seeing in Western Sydney. So the second recommendation is really about how do we invest in building that capacity with the social enterprise sector as just one tangible way of delivering social impact.
Do you think part of the issue, and this is to Ashley, is around terminology? It's a bit like sort of smart cities. What does it actually mean in practice? You know, what are the tangible things here that we can do? Ashley, do you think that is part of the challenge, or do you think part of the challenge is, frankly, it's difficult to measure? And we all know the old adage, you know, it's, you can't manage what you can't measure. And part of the challenges with social outcomes is that they are quite qualitative. We feel them, we instinctively know them, but they are difficult to quantify. What are your thoughts there?
Yes, Sarah, I think, well, for me personally, I think that, you know, it's less about definition and more about measurement. And it is difficult to measure. And, you know, if we look at the way it's working at the moment, it's essentially measured in target and output. So how many hours, you know, have you engaged social enterprise or Indigenous businesses? How much money have you spent? But the reality is that's not measuring impact. It's not really being held accountable within community to determine if we're actually achieving the tangible outcomes we've set out to achieve at the beginning of a project. So I think at the moment we're kind of in those early stages of talking about it, setting targets, measuring those types of outputs. The next layer where I think we'll probably get greater buy-in from the community and potentially political levels when we can start to understand and actually quantify impact on wellbeing, living standards, you know, ripple effects of this investment, because it completely changes the conversation around when we're choosing which projects go ahead and which ones don't, because we're starting to really understand the broader social value of that investment.
Ashley, Danny, the topic of measuring and numbers, people always love a number. What are your thoughts on the challenges there?
Just a forward to the answer. I actually don't think social impact is difficult to measure at all. And I think Chris's 3 slides illustrated outcomes really well: housing, income and education. So we have no difficulty measuring social impact. What the difficulty we have is measuring the means by which to change some of those metrics. And some of that is by the nature of the relationships that we create within the public sector, between the public sector and the private sector, and amongst the private sector in order to drive change in those metrics. So just from an educational point of view, for example, the creation of the Institutes of Advanced Technology is one way of attempting to leverage relationships for the purpose of getting the synergistic result out of different organisations with different talent pools, with different contributions to make to the educational experience, linking that educational experience to the expertise acquired by the individuals going through that experience, then matched to industry requirements. So I don't think measurement here is difficult. I think what is difficult is to find the pathway. I like the 3 recommendations, to find the pathway of doing it better.
The joys of feedback. It's lovely to do things in person again. I've missed that. So some brave person in the audience has given me a question in writing on a piece of paper, so good on you. So I'll ask the question. The question is, how important is it to engage with refugees and asylum seekers in infrastructure procurement, given how many settle in Western Sydney? And in this respect, I'd like to shout out to Fairfield City Council as well, who do an incredible job and take more than their fair share of these important people. What are your thoughts in answer to the question about how do you engage with them in infrastructure procurement? That's an easy one. Who'd like to take that one?
Happy to have a crack to start with. I could give the kind of lived domestic experience, and I'd love to hear Vanessa's view on this as well. I guess from an experience as a Tier 1 contractor, I think we've really recognised the absolute opportunity to engage with particularly the refugee community. And again, gosh, I sound like I love Victoria. I'm actually a very proud New South Wales woman. But some of our great examples have been in Victoria recently, where we've managed to, I guess, recognise that in this huge environment of skill shortage in infrastructure, there are so many skilled refugees and that have come over to Australia and who just haven't been able to get access into the industry because of potentially language barriers, inclusivity or discrimination barriers. So we've done work with partners, so acknowledging that, as construction companies, we're not maybe necessarily the best equipped to go in hands-on with community, but actually partnering with social organisations to get access to those pools of people and actually giving them opportunities to, maybe whether it's safety courses to give them that step into the infrastructure pipeline, whether it's just, giving them 12-month, 6-month programs that then give them the Australian experience that they need to really kickstart a career in infrastructure. So it just feels like such an untapped pool of people that we can really benefit from as an industry.
So sorry, can you just let us know who you are, and can we get a microphone down the front here, and I'll come back to you in a moment if that's okay. We'll get a microphone so we can hear you. But if I can just in the interim just pick up on that question of skills and skills shortages, which we're all experiencing at the moment. And one of the questions from the floor has been in relation to digital and tech areas, and whether Greater Western Sydney is going to be, really growing as an innovation area, an innovation region, a word we all use, and innovation hubs and clusters and all those sorts of things. How are we going to attract and breed the right talent? How are we going to optimise this? Danny, you might have a view on this, but Vanessa as well.
In some ways, again, I'd draw on something the Premier said, which was to have the right sort of people talking about how to make it happen. So if we look around the place at the moment at those locations where we think or claim some good partnership work is occurring, well, yeah, but it could be a lot better, and there could be a lot more people involved, there could be a lot more organisations involved. If we are really going to get serious about the deficits that we know exist, that many people have experienced, and answer that question satisfactorily, we're going to have industry and government truly attend to the question of locality requirements and how those locality requirements can be best met through matching the educational opportunities with the existing labour force or an emerging labour force that best meets the needs in that locality. That planning is pretty patchy.
Vanessa, any comments?
Yeah, look, I probably agree with all of that, and I think partnerships is really key between business, community and government. Yep. Without a doubt.
Copy that. All right, to our colleague down here at the front, what's your name and what's your question?
Yes, so my name is Shazia and I'm from YouGov, but I do a lot of volunteer work, and I'm a welcome ambassador with Settlement Services International and on the committee of the Sutherland Shire Refugee Connection. And that was a question that I asked in relation to refugees and asylum seekers. You mentioned that, there's an untapped pool of talent there. What about those refugees, asylum seekers that, say, don't have experience? Because I do a lot of casework outside of my full-time role, and I'm constantly coming across men that want to work that may not go to TAFE or, for whatever reason. It would be great to see organisations that are here today establish some sort of traineeships and so on. So I'd love to connect with anybody who can offer this, because I'm doing a lot of one-on-one casework. So there is a bit of a gap there somewhere that I'm trying to understand how to complete. But what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think echoing the thought about collaboration, and I think there's probably a part for lots of different groups to play there. There are some great organisations that we work with, like career seekers, that are kind of working on maybe some of the younger generations or people coming through that aren't yet skilled. So I think it's there, but the opportunity to maximise that is absolutely there. So yeah, I'd love to catch up and chat.
Thank you for your excellent question and an offer to help connect some of those dots. All right, so we're going to do sort of the last round of questions now, unless anyone wants to put up their hand and be very brave like our colleague down the front here. No, we'll keep it rolling. So, not that I'm competitive, but if we wanted to be better than Victoria in this space, starting with you, Ashley, of the 3 recommendations in the report, which one, if you could choose, would be the one that you would take forward and you think would have the greatest outcome?
I'm not going to answer it simply, sorry, Sarah. Look, 1 and 2 just have to happen, right? They're the fundamentals, they're the foundational pieces. The government just has to say, yes, this is what we're going to do, we're going to make it a priority and put that in place. Where we've got the opportunity, I think, to leapfrog is thinking about this third recommendation. And look, there's some pros and cons coming from our perspective, but this idea that we would actually think about regions and actually think about pooling resources, effort, energy within particular geographies is a really powerful opportunity. Because then what we do is overcome this top-down government mandate and actually think about building targets, building, opportunity from the bottom up in terms of, and sideways in terms of community input.
And that really builds on a question we had as well around how can we develop the sector overall rather than sort of bleeding dry, quote unquote, the usual suspects from this question. Danny, in reverse order, if you could pick one of 3, which one would you run with?
The third.
Do you want to tell us why, or you are very succinct?
Mainly because that's the machinery, from my point of view, to make it happen.
Yep.
And that's the key thing that I think we're lacking at the moment. It's there, but it's patchy. And I think we have, to a significant extent, although made a lot of progress over the last 10 years, taken a residual approach to social benefit, social impact. Now it's about trying to turn that on its head and say, the Hitachi fellow, I think, said it really well, and it's also my experience with some of the Tier 1 builders. They've got it. From the point of view of how they've had to adjust their industry over the last 10, 15 years, they've got it. But again, it's from a residual impact point of view, not from an institutionalised impact point of view. Third recommendation provides us with the opportunity to institutionalise how we would do that together, in partnership and for the future.
And shout out to Hitachi, one of our partners, who are very committed to Western Sydney and the opportunities that it creates for everyone. So last comment, last word from our author to you, Vanessa. What are your thoughts? If you could pick one of your 3 babies, which one would you run with?
Yeah, I'm going to give you a complicated answer
as well. Good.
That's sorry, Sarah, because I really think what this report highlights is that it's about demand and supply, and the two go hand in hand.
Yep.
Yes, we need to have clear, ambitious targets, objectives, vision, be clear about what outcomes we're trying to achieve, but we need to have that bottom-up approach and really build the supply, because that is the problem, and then implement it in Western Sydney. So all 3 recommendations.
Well, that's very neat. That's a very neat way to end, but I think, when we look and acknowledge the sheer scale of opportunity we have, now's the time. So thank you to our panel. Thank you to everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers.